educational webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about supply chain management and Dynamics SL. We're going to be focusing on the purchasing, inventory, and order management modules today. So let's talk a little bit about SIS before we get started. We were founded in 1996 and we're in Duluth, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. We deliver business solutions that help project and service-driven companies unify their business processes and applications across the enterprise, and that allows you to have better visibility and efficiency. We focus on specific types of companies, mostly project-based companies, even though today's webinar is not project-focused. We focus on the construction general contractor area, engineering and architecture, specialty contractors such as plumbing, mechanical, electrical, oil and gas, energy contractors and services, and professional services and government contractors. Why would you want to partner with SIS? Well, we've been a Microsoft Gold certified partner and we have over 20 years of experience working with Dynamics SL. We're one of the largest Dynamics SL partners out there. We have a dedicated support and customer care team with a 888 number right there. We have very experienced folks working for us, doing consulting, development, and even our partners are very focused on Dynamics SL. We understand your industry's best practices and the software in order to bridge that gap between business and technology. In other words, we know how to implement Dynamics SL for these industries very well. We can bridge the gaps. And we also have broad industry-focused solutions for not only Dynamics SL, but we also have industry solutions for Dynamics CRM, Dynamics 365, and Microsoft SharePoint. Okay, so for today's webinar, please make sure you put your computer in full screen mode on the GoToWebinar. It's the box up in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And we'll have questions at the end. And you can type questions in the question box down in the bottom right-hand corner of your GoToWebinar panel. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to our consultant, Mr. Dan Walsh, who is going to take it from here. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. I've been with SIS almost 10 years now. My background is in accounting. I've been a controller for a number of different companies. I've worked with SL for almost 20 years. Most of that time I've been as a consultant, but I've also been a controller for one of our clients. So I've seen, Dynamics SL from both sides, as an end user and as a consultant. So I'm pretty well versed, and my specialty is in purchasing, order management, inventory. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go through each of the modules, starting with purchasing. And I've tried to structure it so that, we're going to look at some things where I know that, I've run into issues in the past with clients, areas where they've had problems. And so we're going to look at those, to avoid those problems, to deal with those problems, and also look at some functionality that you may or may not be aware of, to kind of get the most use out of each module. Okay, so we're going to start with purchasing. Every module has a setup screen. And even if you've been using SL for years, it's always a good thing to go back and look at the setup, just to make sure that all the different options and settings, et cetera, that you understand them and that they're proper for your environment and for your processes. And we're not going to cover every individual item in the setup screens, but I want you to understand that. And usually you have a very limited number of people that can access the screen, maybe even just one person, kind of like your system administrator. But someone should, at some point, and it's good to do because it may not have been done for years and things may have changed, is to go into these setup screens in each module and just look at each item and see if it makes sense the way it's set up. Go from tab to tab. And I always tell people one of the greatest tools in SL, and I use it myself often in training and or just if I have questions, is to use the help menu. And that can be accomplished by hitting the F1 key. And it's context sensitive. So whenever you do that, it's going to take you right into the area that for the screen that you have open. And then you can drill down into each tab and then it'll tell you, individually what each field is and what the relevancy is and how to use those fields. So I absolutely encourage you to take some time and look at all the setup screens for each module. Purchasing is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of screens. The two main screens are going to be where you enter purchase orders and then when you receive the purchase orders. We're going to take a look at the purchase order maintenance. First thing is the first field is the purchase order type. Typically, 90% or more of your purchase orders will be just regular orders. You can also do drop ship orders, and when you do a drop ship, you're going to designate that this order is going to be shipped to somewhere else. Okay, it's not going to go into our inventory and then get issued out. It will never touch inventory. So when you select a drop ship, it really limits the options that you have in the purchase form. So if we do a regular order, you'll see that there's, quite a few different options. But if we switch to drop ship, it's really limited to these items. The main one's going to be goods for drop ship. What that does is you will not do a receipt for these items. You'll do a voucher in accounts payable for all the drop ships, and there will be no financial effect until you actually do the voucher. And when you go into the voucher screen, you'll pick the vendor, and then you'll find this drop ship purchase order, and it'll populate all the lines from the purchase order, and then you can go ahead and invoice it. And once it's fully invoiced, the purchase order will then go to a completed status. So I think a lot of people don't use this as much as maybe they could. I think it's great functionality, but the key with the drop ship, and really with any of these purchase order line types or purchase order types, you can put anything you want in the inventory ID. I'm sorry, no, you want to select the item. My vendor. Okay. Not sure why that all of a sudden is not working. I apologize. So this is one that I've done just recently, did a drop ship. Most organizations cannot have a dedicated, purchasing agent. It's just not feasible. So they typically delegate the purchase orders to different people in the organization, which is fine, but it's really critical when you're doing purchase orders. There's certain items that you need to select that are going to affect the way this item is processed. I just had a client recently. They were doing some drop ships. And one of the things, probably the most important item to enter, is going to be the account that this drop ship is going to hit on the financial statements. Certainly, you don't want to pick the inventory account. You typically don't want to pick the AP accrual account, because that's used for receipts, for purchase order types where you actually get a receipt. So it's very important that the person entering the purchase order understands the account information. You want to make sure that they pick the proper account, because then when you do the voucher, that account and the sub-account are going to show up in the voucher. When you release the voucher, that's going to then update the financial statements. So it's very important that the people that are entering the purchase orders are familiar with the account, and that you can trust them to select the proper account and sub-account. Because a lot of times I've had people, like, they have so many different employees entering purchase orders, and they end up with account information. Like I said, I had one recently that was using the AP accrual account. And we're going to look at that in a little bit, but that has to do with the general ledger account where receipts get posted to, and then when you do the voucher, it takes it out of that account. So account selection is really, really critical. The other thing you can do with the drop ships is you can select where do you want this purchase order to get sent to. So let's say you're doing, you're ordering some goods for, for a customer. You can actually pick the customer site and then pick their, pick the customer and then pick their site and auto-populate. You can overwrite the address, put in whatever address you want. Like I said, there's no receipt for a drop ship purchase order. When you get the invoice from the vendor, you'll pick the vendor and then you'll pick the purchase order number. And then it'll default, the account, the sub-account, et cetera, everything will default from the purchase order. And once you voucher the purchase order, you see this one's already been vouchered. See, fully vouchered, and of course it'll never be received. It's not something you can receive. If you would actually try to go into the receipt entry screen, it won't even be available. Right? You can pick the vendor and you can pick that purchase order, but it won't. When you do an F3, it won't be available. It's just because it's a drop ship. But once it's been fully vouchered, you can set the status will automatically be set to completed, which is very important. But let's say that you received only part of it. The vendor did not ship the full amount. The full drop ship did not get sent out. You can still change the status to completed if you're not going to receive any more of that purchase order, right? So if you order 10, they shipped 8, you say, you know what, we don't want the other 2. You would then want to come into this purchase order and set the status to completed instead of from open order. And that's important to maintain the status of purchase orders. I also see where I have a lot of clients where they'll have purchase orders that are a couple years old and they're still in an open status. And as a controller and as an accountant, I typically don't like to see that. So I always like to ask people to try and set up one person, even if you don't have a purchasing agent, set up someone that's responsible for managing the purchase orders. And one way to do that, I think the best report is to run this purchase order register. I typically like to go back on this report. There's 2 reports we're going to look at. I like to go back from the beginning period back to the point where we actually started using SL. That way I'm going to see every potential open order, right? So I'll make it something like, whatever's reasonable. But then when you preview it, it's a real nice, concise report. It'll show you the status. So you can filter this out so you can just want to see open ones. But it's a real nice report because it's real simple, one line item. It's easy to export out to Excel. But I really encourage every organization to have somebody that manages their purchase orders. And if they find ones that are old, they're technically done, they should set the status to completed. So any purchase order, the status can be updated. And you could actually limit maybe who has access to this field. You know what I mean? If you want to designate someone to manage this, through customization, you can go in and say, okay, only 2 different people have the ability to change the status. So normally the status is going to get updated based on activity, whether it's been received, whether it's been vouchered, etc. So definitely want to keep up with the purchase orders, keep them in a current status. Because they don't have a financial effect when they're still open, but if you're using projects, they will still be out there as commitments on those projects, which I think can be misleading. So you definitely want to manage the purchase orders. Okay, so on a regular purchase order, another area that I think people struggle with sometimes are the purchase for types. There's 3 or 4 different categories. There's a couple ones like description line, which really is just that. It doesn't do anything. It's just a line on the purchase order. If you wanted to put in Something in the description field. Here if you could put in, some notes, that you want to show up as a line item on the purchase order versus, putting notes in at the purchase order level, right? That's what the description line is for. And you don't receive it, nothing happens with that description line. The other types of purchase fors are ones that affect inventory. And the ones that affect inventory, whenever you pick a goods for inventory and you pick an item, you'll go over, you'll see the account is going to be locked in and cannot be changed. It's always going to be set to the inventory account as you defined in the purchase order setup screen. So in the PO setup screen, we tell it this is our inventory account. So every time you pick one of the purchase for types that are goods, that affect inventory, it's going to lock it in where it can only use that account, which means it's going to go into inventory, and then depending on the type, it'll come out of inventory when you confirm the shipper, when you confirm the sale, when you issue it out, if it's for a goods for project inventory. So all the ones that say goods for inventory, goods for project inventory, goods for sales order, and goods for project sales order, they're all going to be tied to the inventory account. And what that'll do is when you pick that item, and it's one of those types, especially if it's a goods for project sales order or goods for sales order, it allocates the amount on this purchase order specifically for that sales order or that project sales order or that project, or if you're just doing project inventory. And that'll show up when you're in the inventory item, it'll show up as one of the buckets under allocation. When you're in your quantities, it'll show you on a sales order, shipped not invoiced, allocated to a project, right? So those buckets will get populated once you do the purchase order, right? And you receive it, it'll be in inventory, but it won't be available. Your available is going to be decreased by these buckets where it's been allocated. And then when you process the sales order, you confirm the shipper, it'll ship that, take it out of on hand, and relieve the allocation. The other types of purchase fors have nothing to do with inventory. So you can do goods for project. And here, for all of the ones that are not for inventory, there's goods for project, there's non-inventory goods, services for expense, and services for project. Again, kind of like the drop ship, it's really critical that the account is entered properly. Because this is not going to go through inventory, it's going to go directly to expense. And they can be received, but it's not going to update inventory. The two that you will not receive are going to be the goods for services and goods for project. They do not allow receipts. Or services for expense, services for project, that will not be received. You can do a receipt on the non-inventory goods, but it's not mandatory. You can go straight to voucher. But once again, I always encourage people, use the F1 help key. They have a really good description in here of all the purchase fors. And a lot of people just aren't that familiar with these. So I absolutely encourage your users that are processing purchase orders to go ahead and look at this, get familiar with these. And even, if you have a test environment, if they haven't used some of the functionality, go into the test environment, process it all the way, through the purchase order, through a receipt if needed, through the voucher, make sure that it's going to update the accounts that you want. Because I find one of the biggest problems with purchasing is how it affects the financials. And it doesn't affect the financials till you do the receipt and or till you do the voucher. So absolutely encourage people to be very familiar with the purchase for. Probably the most important part of this when you're starting a purchase order. The purchase order will start off as a purchase order, and some people get confused on this too. It'll change to open purchase order once you actually print the purchase order and or do a receipt. right? So it'll start off as a purchase order. As soon as I print it, it'll change that status to open. So if you see, that's the difference between, the purchase order and the open order. You can also cancel an order. If you decide at some point that it's not valid. If it's already been processed and you're not going to receive any more, I would set the status to completed. If you've not used it at all and it just needs to get canceled, I would go ahead and cancel the order. One of the items here that you can use is the goods for sales order and goods for project sales order. And we have one of these entered. I think I have one in here already. Yes. So when you have one that's a goods for sales order, you'll see a button down here that'll show you the link for the sales order. So this line came from and is attached to this sales order in order management. And you can go either way. You could start off from the sales order, and we're going to look at that, or you could create a purchase order and then link it up afterwards. And what it's going to do is when you click on the sales order, you can do an F3 here, and it's going to go out and find every sales order that has that item on it. And then it'll let you link to it. If you do it from the sales order, that link happens automatically. So we'll take a look at that. Probably the biggest issue that I run into with purchasing, and I can't emphasize enough how important this is. When you're doing the purchase orders and in the PO setup, we established this AP accrual account. The AP accrual account is used when you do receipts. So from an accounting standpoint, if you think about the, like the T accounts, when you enter a purchase order, no financial effect, right? You can save it, nothing happens. If it's an item that gets received, as soon as you receive that purchase order and you release the receipt batch, it's going to debit the inventory and it's going to credit this AP accrual. And then when you go in to do the voucher and you put in the vendor and you find that purchase order and you find that receipt and you process that voucher batch, it will take that receipt and consider it vouchered, right? So you pick your PO, then you pick your receipt for that vendor. And when you release this batch, that receipt is no longer going to be unvouchered and it'll take it out of the 2005. Right? So the receipt, put it in, the voucher takes it out of 2005. Well, guess what? If you receive vouchers and you don't find the receipt for that voucher, you're gonna have a credit that's gonna sit in that unvouchered account forever. It'll never come out. And I would say probably 90% of my clients that use purchasing at some point in time have been unable to reconcile the balance on their trial balance, and this is really important, the balance on their trial balance in that account. So when you run a trial balance and you look at that account 2005, it's going to have a number, right? This is the value that's in that GL account. That value should match up to what's in the report called unvouchered receipts. And once you've gotten to a certain point, you almost have to kind of regroup and get them into balance. I have a client that runs this report after they've released all their batches and everything at the end of the day. They run the unvouchered receipts and they compare it to the GL after they posted everything in the GL every morning. And every once in a while they'll come to me and say, Dan, we have this issue. And it's real easy to identify the problem because it's only one day's worth of transactions to look at. If you let it go for a week or months, it's almost impossible. There's just too much activity. So normally, just like the other purchase order register, I always encourage people to run this report from day one. That might be a little extreme, but if you've been using SL for 60 some years. Okay, now I have two versions of this. The standard one is kind of crowded, as I'd like to say. You know, it has a lot of information on it that I personally don't like. I mean, I look at that report and I go, that's just too much stuff. So I created a summary version of it, and I'd be glad to share that with everybody. You know what I mean? I can, you know, install it for you. It's a real quick, simple report. But the summary one is really simple. It's going to give you one line item for every unvouchered receipt. It's going to give you the receipt number, the receipt date, the purchase order number, and the amount. This, to me, is a lot easier to manage. So if I look at some really old stuff on here, I'm going to say, why is this receipt still here? These two, I see that they offset. We did a return. But I'm going to start asking myself, why do I have $24,000 in an unvouchered receipt? So then I'd go and look at that purchase order. I'd look at the vendor. I'd go into the vendor maintenance. I'd look at the documents. Maybe there was an invoice that we did that we didn't match up to this receipt. That's very bad, because that's where you're going to get a disconnect between the general ledger and that unvouchered report, because it never got cleared out. Depending on what version you're on, the last couple of versions of SL actually have kind of a nice process to handle that. And you can do it through accounts payable. There's this link AP and PO document. So let's say you've entered a voucher and you forgot to put in the PO and receipt number. You didn't do the matching. You can go into this screen and do the matching. You have to put in the vendor ID and bring up the invoice number. So it's a little bit of work, but it's a nice feature. It'll give you that ability to match them up. Now, if you find that you have just, you know, dozens of these things, you know, there's also a way where we can go ahead and clean out those unvouchered receipts, you know, and then you'd have to do a journal entry. But the key is that you need to get those in sync. They need to be in balance. Just like you do your accounts receivable, your accounts payable subledgers, right? The unvouchered is basically a subledger. You know, it's something that's on your balance sheet. And so you need to get this report in sync with your GL. We'd be glad to help with that. You know, a couple other tools that, you know, that we can use to manage that. Last thing on purchase orders, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, but is to use the purchase order register to manage the open POs. You know, I don't like to see a bunch of old purchase orders sitting out there. You know, they either should be canceled or they should be set to completed. You know, it's just like a housekeeping chore that someone should be assigned to do it, maybe once a week. So I think in summary, the key is that, you know, when you have someone that's processing purchase orders, make sure that they understand the availability of using the drop ships, but very importantly too, is that that person has to be capable. And if they're not sure, I would always encourage them to, you know, to check with someone in the accounting department, what account do we want to use for this purchase, right? Because that's going to flow through to the voucher, and that's going to affect your financials. Okay, so let's move on to inventory. Inventory obviously has a lot of functionality. I encourage you again here, there's a lot of stuff in the setup screen that's going to affect the way inventory processes. But before we do that, I do want to show you one more thing on the line of the unvouchered. There's a feature in the AP setup screen, and I just actually had a client who came to me and said, you know what, our unvouchered is a mess. We have all this stuff in it. And one of the tools that I showed them is to have this box checked, warn of unvouchered purchase orders. What that'll do is when you go to enter a voucher for a particular vendor, and it's just a warning, but it'll go out for that vendor and it'll say, it'll look to see if you have any unvouchered receipts. Now, we turned it on for them, and since they had just so much stuff in it, they were getting that message constantly. So I think we ended up turning it back off, but I absolutely recommend having that checked. It's just one way to avoid entering an invoice where we have a receipt out there, or we have a purchase order out there for a drop ship or a non-receipt, and we're not matching them up. So along the lines of looking at your setup screens, look at the AP setup, look at this, do the help, read about it, and you might want to consider turning it on. And it's just a warning, it doesn't keep them from processing or moving on. So it's definitely something you might want to turn on and test it. And, until maybe if you have to do some cleanup, do the cleanup and then turn it on. So same thing with the other modules. I encourage you to go into the IN setup, look at the different options. And some of them are critical. Allowing or not allowing negative inventory, using multiple warehouses. Where are we going to get the cost of goods sold? So there's a lot of things here, your inventory accounts. Here's our inventory account. Here's whenever we do adjustments, what accounts are going to hit. So there's a lot of important information in here, including scheduling. And scheduling has to do with how the availability is determined and who gets inventory over, prioritize-wise. Most of my clients have the scheduling turned off. I do have some that use it turned on. Once again, I would encourage you to take a look at what that means. Go into the scheduling tab and read about, how turning this on and what the effect is. Inventory, if you're using multiple sites, and this is sometimes where people will get confused. I've actually had people using inventory for a while and never necessarily realized this, but everything is done at the site level if you have multiple sites. If you look at the inventory item screen and you're looking at quantities, etc., these are going to be an aggregation of all the different sites. So if you have multiple sites, this is helpful, but it really doesn't show you, I don't think, at the proper level. You can do that by looking at inventory sites, which is a good screen. You have to put in the ID, and then you can pick the site, and then you can see what your quantities are, what your costs are for that site. Because all the costs and average costs and everything is going to be kept at the site level. All this information is kept at the site level. Another area that people tend to get kind of confused about or aren't sure what to do are these quantity buckets. And they all come from somewhere. If you look at this screen, none of them have any way to drill down with the exception of the allocated the projects. And this one will actually show you the projects and the quantities, that amount is allocated to. But an option is to go into the status inquiry screen. And this is probably my favorite screen in SL. So we'll look at one item. This screen, when it comes to kind of digging in and drilling into the details, is a really good screen. It came out with this screen a couple versions ago, and I use it a lot. I encourage all my clients to use it a lot. It's just full of information. It'll give you the basic information up here too. What type of item it is, valuation methods, etc. But it'll show you site by site what we have on hand, what's available. But again, you'll see there's no real way to drill down into most of these buckets. This screen gives you some availability to do that, especially with the order management documents. So if I want to see what's on open shippers, I can click on the OM documents. And I can say, what statuses do I want to see? And it gives me two options. I can look at sales orders, I can look at shippers. Typically, I want to just look at open ones. I can say refresh sales orders, and it's going to show me all the different sales orders. Now, quotes don't affect availability, so you can pretty much ignore those. But if you tab over, you'll see this one order has a quantity of 8, and that's what shows up on my open sales orders. I can do the same thing for shippers. Because what happens is people will look at that number and they say, why do I have all this allocated? You need to go into this screen, look at it, and then I want to say, okay, should this order even be open? Right? I can click on that order, and then I can view the order, look at the date of the order, just determine whether or not the order should be canceled, which would then relieve my allocation, right? So it gives you a really good tool to manage the allocations for the order management. I can do the same thing for the shippers. I could do, I'll open shippers, and they'll show me the shippers. Same thing. I have 8 on an open shipper, and I can drill down into that shipper. And you can do some other filtering based on the customer and time frames, etc. The other really nice feature here is this transaction detail. This will let you drill in for this item, and you can filter it based on the site, which it'll default to the site that you're on, the line item that you're on. And then you can filter out, what do I want to see? Do I want to see my receipts? Do I want to see just what I've issued? Right? What do I want to see my adjustments? Right? And then you click on refresh, and it'll show you all the transactions from day one, unless you put a date range in here for that item. So if I go back to all tran types, refresh, it's going to show me everything. I can export this to Excel. Right? And it'll be in Excel. That way I can do some filtering on it on my own. The only thing I think is a little bit odd with this screen, and I've never really kind of followed up on it, but it'll show 2 items. One will show cost of sales, and one will show the invoice, right? And they're kind of a duplicate. So I usually filter out, the invoice part of it and just have the cost of goods, because then I could do pluses and minuses, and it'll literally end up, if you sum them up, to be my on hand. So great screen, the transaction screen. This over here is interesting because this will show me items that have not been released yet too. Let's say I have an issues batch or an adjustments batch that's still not been released. If I just want to see just what's been released and refresh, in this case, it'll probably give me everything the same, but sometimes I'll look at this if I'm doing some type of analysis, and I'll see whether or not that number changes, right? If it changes and it gives me less items under released, then I know I have some stuff out there that's not been released yet, some transactions. So this inventory status screen, excellent screen, love it. Just like on the order side of things, on the purchase order side, it's critical that the inventory is reconciled to the general ledger. And I know I'm probably telling you something you already know, but again, it happens. I mean, I get clients and they'll send in a support ticket and they say, we're out of sync. And I say, how long has it been? They say, oh, maybe since last month or the end of the year. And I'm like, that's a lot of work to figure out why. I recommend at least on a weekly basis, you run the inventory status report and you compare it to your general ledger. My client that does the unvouchered, they do their inventory one every day too. And I don't have a problem with that. It only takes a few minutes. The reason being, for most organizations, they have so much activity in inventory that if you let it go too long, boy, it's really hard to figure it out, right? So absolutely encourage the reconciliation to be done at least weekly, if not daily. It's really worth doing. We'll take a real quick look too at the physical inventory process. Then I want to jump into order management. Of course, we're covering a lot of stuff today. I wanted to do that on purpose because, without digging in deep on too much of it, I just wanted to show you a lot of the areas that I think are really important. Physical inventory, very nice. I'm actually going to a client tomorrow. They haven't been using this the way they want to, right? So I'm going to go out and we're going to kind of get them started to do some cycle counts. But really what it does is the generate inventory tags will go out and say, okay, give me everything that you want to count. And you either can do a full inventory, you can do cycle counts. Cycle count, you assign items to the cycles, right? And then you pick them, cycle A, B, C, whatever, right? These people actually do it on a daily basis. They might put 10 items in each cycle, right? So they're doing counts every day. So once you generate the tags, you give it an account ID, you print this report called the IN count sheet, and it'll list all the items. I always recommend that you do not include the book quantity because, if someone's out in the warehouse and they're going through counting stuff, if they see 10 on a list, they might count and say, oh yeah, there's 10. So I always encourage to go with the no book quantity. You print this out, you give it to your people, let them do the counts. Once you've done the counts, then you come in here, you enter the counts. Pretty straightforward. You bring up that count ID, you select the tags, you enter the physical counts. Once you've entered them all, you save it. Then you come into this Reconcile Physical Inventory screen. And this is going to show you, oops, not that one, sorry, the review screen. And this will show you each item, and it'll show you the variance. So you could export this out to Excel and maybe, order it based on quantity variance or cost variance. And that's where I say, okay, we have this big variance. Why is that? We need to go recount these ones. This just doesn't look right. The other option is to run the report called the Physical IN Count Sheets, and it looks just like that screen, only it's a report. You print this out, and then you can go through and, decide if you want to do any recounts. Oops, I'm sorry, I printed the wrong one. You want to do the review one, Physical Inventory Variance Review. Okay, so the process works very well. When I worked for the distribution company, inventory was a huge thing for us. We had 10,000 items, and I'll be honest with you, probably 8,000 of them were active. So we did a lot of physical counting, we did a lot of cycle counts. It's a great process. Okay, let's take a look at order management. Kind of running a little behind, so we're going to try and get through all the OM stuff, because order management is probably has so much built-in flexibility that sometimes it can be, I don't want to say overwhelming, but it can really be hard for people to utilize everything. But it all comes from setting up the order types. So if you've used order management, you're familiar with the order types, but there's one called All, and this has all the steps in it. This is really crazy, right? So these are all the things that SL has set up that you can do. And again, you're not going to do all these, but it's nice to look at this, and every business is going to be different, right? Everyone's going to do order management different. It's very unique. But, I'll look at this sometimes, and I'll talk to a customer, and I say, you know what? Actually doing some type of a confirmation on the receipt. Maybe we do want to print an inspection order, but they didn't know it was there. So I always encourage people to go ahead and look at this. And you can actually cut and paste from here into one of the other sales orders. So I can copy this line item, right? And then go into maybe my outside, and I can actually do an insert here and insert that line item. So the order types is very flexible. It really can be tailored to your processes. And I've done that quite a bit. I've done a lot of work with, managing the order steps. The accounts also very, very important. So there's a system set up in here where you can tell it, where am I going to get the account and the sub-account for these different categories. Typically your sales, cost of sales, freight are your most important ones, right? And if you look at the accounts, you can put in wildcards. You can actually, like in this case, something they hard code. You can also put in a wildcard and say, at IT, get it from the inventory item. Get it from the site. So it's very important if you find that you don't have a lot of flexibility, or you're wondering maybe where some of these accounts are getting, posted from, you can use this to target specific accounts for specific order types to hit specific accounts. Very powerful, very flexible. If we look at order setup, one thing that I've always liked, and again, I use it a lot at the distribution company I was with, was the discount pricing. And if you're doing any kind of manual price calculations, this is worth looking at. There's there's a hierarchy where you can say, okay, this customer is going to get this % discount, or this customer price class, or maybe this customer and this price class. So you have up to 9 different levels where you can set up price discounts or markups, depending which way you want to go. And it'll take the base price that you have set up in that item, and it'll apply either the discount or the markup to come up with a sales price. So it really removes, you know, the salesperson's manual process of determining pricing. And it's a really nice feature. I have probably half a dozen people that use this extensively. But what they'll do is it'll go through when you're doing a sales order and you put in the customer and you put in the item, it'll find the first match here. And then it'll go onto the sales price screen and say, okay, do I have a match? If it has a match, then it's going to apply the markup based on what price class that customer's in. And it can be based on, you know, the type of, you know, the sales unit. And then you can also have quantity breaks. Up to 100, they get this percent. Over 100, they get that percent. So just a whole bunch of flexibility in pricing. So if you're doing anything manual when it comes to pricing, it's really nice because it takes away the potential for error. It's going to give you consistency, and hopefully it'll give you better profit margins, you know, if you're applying it properly and set up properly. So if you look at the sales order screen and or the shipper screen, when I say flexibility, the thing I like about the sales order process, let's just bring up an open one here. And it's open. Is that you have things like on the other information tab, right? You can do consolidated invoicing. You can set up a customer and say, if I have a sales order and I ship it 5 different times, I can put all of those shippers on one invoice if I'm using consolidated invoicing. And that can be done on an order-by-order basis, but you have to set it up in the customer record to say, okay, this customer has that available to them. So if you take a look at customer maintenance, and I do have customers that use this, you know, I mean, you know, they'll have customers and they say, you know what, I don't want to get 5 shippers for this. I want this one sales order, everything to be on one. So if you pick Consolidated Invoice and then you pick the level, it'll let you do that. So then when you go to put an order in, it'll automatically default to that being checked, but you can uncheck it on an order-by-order level or order-by-order basis. So I really like that feature. And there's actually a separate report that you run. It's called a Consolidated Invoice, that as soon as all the shippers are done for that order, you run the Consolidated Invoice. Right? It's separate from the regular invoice. So very nice feature. I really like that. You know, you also have, you know, back orders allowed. Ship complete means that until you have all the items in stock, it won't create the shipper. You know, so maybe you have some stuff out on purchase orders. Once they get received, the system using the process manager will automatically, once everything's in stock, it'll go out and create the shipper for that item. And you have the ability to drop ships. Oh, one really nice functionality that it's actually a separate module, but it's not very expensive to purchase. When you can take orders, find one here. And when we were talking about purchase orders before, and we said you can have line items that are attached to purchase orders. So when you enter a sales order, you can actually attach, you can create purchase orders for specific line items for specific vendors. This is really cool. Again, it's an extra module. It's called order to purchase, but it's not very expensive and it's not hard to implement, but it gives you these additional fields, right? So you say, these 2 line items I want to buy from this vendor. These ones I want to buy from that vendor. So when you enter an order, you print out your confirmation, right? And like for the one client, I added the available order confirmation report so they could see what they needed. And then they say, okay, let's get these items from this vendor. You know, they'll call the vendor up. Do you have them? Yes. Once you save this sales order and refresh it and move off of it, it'll automatically create those purchase orders for you. And then you have the link here. If you click on the PO button, it'll show you all the purchase orders out there for this sales order. You can click on it and then take a look at that purchase order. So order to purchase is really, really a nice feature. If you run into situations where you have big orders, we only have so much in stock, we want to manage the purchasing right from the sales order. It's a great feature to have the order to purchase. The other option is you can actually just come in and do a purchase order, right? You can do, you pick a vendor and then you say auto create the PO. The only thing that'll do is that'll put all of the items that are already on a purchase order onto a new PO, and then you have to go in and delete the ones that you don't want. But the nice thing is that it keeps that purchase order, when you receive it, it keeps it allocated to this specific order so that it's not available for other sales orders. Okay? So order to purchase, using the purchase order and attaching it to sales orders is a great feature. Most of my clients use it, very effective. One other thing I want to show you, I just ran into this recently. Whenever you run the whole order management process, you have an order, create a shipper, you go through the order steps, right? And the nice thing is this event history button, if you've not used it before, I love it. So if someone says, what did you do on that order? Or someone says, no, I printed that. You know what? You can go in and look at the event history. It's going to tell you who the user was and the date and time that they did the specific steps, right? Event history, great screen. Use it a lot. Almost sounded like Donald Trump there, didn't I? The other thing is when you process the shipper and it's completed, you get the sales journal ID. And sometimes people want to say, you know what? I want to know what batch this invoice was in. A lot of people don't realize that you can reprint the sales journal. Let me find one that's closed. And then we're going to go to question and answers. I thank you for your patience. We've covered a lot of stuff. I hope it's been some information that you can use. Thank you. So let's just pick one of these. Okay, so we have the sales journal ID here. When you run a sales journal, that creates the issues batch and it creates the accounts receivable batch. But let's say you want to know what batch this was on. You can reprint this sales order. Normally, when you go into sales order, it's just going to give you, what hasn't been processed yet. But if you go into options and you type in that journal ID, that's a 10-digit thing, so it's 62414. This will show you the information on that sales journal, which can be very useful when you're trying to hunt something down or find out why, where it was in accounts receivable, what batch it was in, right? So then you could find that invoice, and it'll tell you the AR and IN batch. So it's a good thing to keep in mind, running the sales journal. And again, it doesn't recreate batches, it doesn't change anything, it just shows you what's already been done. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. Again, hope it was very useful. So we can go ahead and do some questions and answers now. Let me see if we have anybody. All right, we do have some questions. Okay, I would like to see the goods for inventory have the option of selecting the account and sub-account. Okay, so the reason it doesn't, because when you go to do that reconciliation between inventory and GL, now you can have for specific items, a specific site, you can put in the inventory account. So you can do it at the item level, right? Right, so that someone actually provided the answer. Thanks, Dan. So you can do it on an item by item basis, which account's going to get hit. Other than that, you can't change it. Okay, next question. It should be an option in the PO and IM setup screen. Yeah, and I'm sure there's good reasons why it's not there. So I think we kind of answered it there. And Bill, that's something that we could certainly kind of, investigate with you to maybe see how it's been an issue for you, and maybe maybe there is some kind of workaround or some kind of a customization we might be able to to do. So I absolutely encourage you to reach out to myself or to Debbie Peavy, and we can set up a quick call or go to meeting or whatever, just to kind of review those that your situation. Be glad to do that anytime you want. Just let me know. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, Mr. Franklin, anything that you want to add?
Well, I was going to ask if you could show the connection between purchasing and order management, and you did. So I think you covered it very well. Very good job, Dan.
Yeah, that was a lot of stuff. Absolutely. I would encourage everyone on this today, if you have any questions, reach out to us either through support, through Debbie, through myself, and we can answer your questions. We will if we want to do a go-to-meeting. Just would love for you to use the functionality that's out there, and or deal with problems or issues that you've had. So look forward to working with you in the future, and thank everyone for attending. I know it's hard to find time in the middle of the day.
Dan, can you move it to the next slide? I want to talk about the DSLUG conference before we let everybody go.
Yes, I can do that. Oops.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So before you all take off, we just want to remind you that the Dynamics SL User Group Conference is coming up in a few weeks. It's April 23rd through 26th in St. Louis. And you can save $100 off your registration if you use the code that you see there, the DSLUG 18SIS100C. And there's going to be a lot of great content. The new Dynamics SL 2018 is going to be released on May 1st, and you're going to get a good view of the new version of Dynamics SL during the conference and be able to talk to the folks from Microsoft, and they'll be able to answer your questions about what's new and exciting coming with Dynamics SL 2018. Also, SIS, we're going to be presenting a few topics. One of the ones I'm going to be presenting is on manufacturing in Dynamics SL. And so we hope to see you all there. And thanks, everybody, for your time this afternoon to learn a little bit about Dynamics SL, purchasing, inventory, and order management. Thank you very much, Mr. Dan Walsh. Great job. And everybody have a great day.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody.